there might be something on this vessel. Maybe it's weapons that were, illegally being brought into Venezuela, air and missile defense, advanced. I don't know, but you're right. It seems to be that if it was just about the oil and it never came to port to get the oil, why the pursuit? Why the direct confrontation with Russia? Why would it be worth it? We might find out that it's more than just about the ship, or it might be that the new policy is we're going to seize all of these sanctioned ships wherever they are.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Mick Mulroy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the US. Mick, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Great to be with you again, Fergus.
Now, you slightly teased it before we actually started recording, but we've only been in January for a week, and what a week it has been so far. The massive news is today. There is a lot of information here, so I'll try and explain it as best I can for our audience that might not have seen it. The big news is that the US has seized a sanctioned oil tanker in the North Sea that's linked to both Russia and Venezuela. It was originally a Guyanese vessel, but since changed its flag to Russian and its name from the Bella 1 to the Marinera. The US tried to board it in December near Venezuela after its journey from Iran. That's part of the US blockade on sanctioned oil tankers. And for the last 2 weeks, it's been sort of in the Atlantic, and it was taken today between Iceland and Great Britain. Mick, we'll get into some of the specifics in a second, but just off the bat, what is your reaction to this massive news today?
Well, of course, it comes on the heels of the apprehension of Maduro, which by U.S. law is lawful. I think it will be deemed that way as he goes forward in trials, but by the international law, there's going to be some questions there. Probably the same thing with the seizure of the special. They are sanctioned vessels. There's many of them. Quite frankly, this is one of the main means that countries get around the actual economic sanctions is by selling oil on the black market with a shadow fleet. And so we've identified many of them. And as you already pointed out, Fergus, it went from one flag to the other flag, one name to the other name, which really indicates that it knew it was doing illicit activities. So I think from the U.S. perspective, the only way to essentially enforce its sanctioning of vessels is to be willing to actually seize it. And that is what's been done today. It's a complicated military operation just because of, at sea underway. I doubt it was opposed, so I don't think there was any armed opposition to the seizure of it. That would make it even more complicated. But I think this is probably just the beginning. And there are several Trump administration officials that are talking about it being just the beginning and not just related to Venezuela. In fact, one that was just on before we started talking was basically equating it to the war in Ukraine and how this could be a message to Russia, which obviously is claiming this vessel, that the days of just selling their oil illicitly on the black market might be coming to an end.
You said it was just the beginning there. I mean, like I said, we're only a few days into January. So much has happened already. Venezuela, we might talk about Greenland a bit later. These tankers here, quite a lot of it, I think, is linked. What has happened between the relationship with the US and Russia in the last few days? And why do you think Trump has sort of taken this week to perform this kind of maelstrom of activity at the start of 2026?
So if you look at the 2025 national security strategy, it really does shift focus from historically where the United States has been focused, which is essentially the globe. Yes, we had priorities, but we've never, except for going all the way back to the, early 1800s, this Monroe Doctrine, as the president keeps referring to. But after World War II, we have really had a European-centric focus on our security, and we have viewed China, Russia as our lead adversaries collectively, and of course the rogue nations of North Korea and Iran as a secondary tier. Now we seem to be focused on the Western Hemisphere, and we can see that playing out, and in a way that almost deems the United States to be hegemonic to the point of the Western Hemisphere is ours. In fact, they put out pictures, the State Department saying exactly that. There's one thing to say we're going to focus on the Western Hemisphere. There's another thing to say that it somehow belongs to the United States.
How did that make you feel when you saw those?
That's entirely against what the U.S. has standed for and wanted to stand for throughout its history. If you look at, it's always been shaped by many presidents, but one that I refer to is like the Reagan doctrine, where the United States is the leader of the free world, which comes with responsibility, not just accolades, right? It means that we are the main partner in NATO, that we defend our allies, that we represent democracies around the world, that we support democracies, individual civil liberties, and human rights around the world. That doesn't seem to be part of this new equation. In fact, when Maduro was removed, there is a lawfully recognized government of Venezuela. It's the opposition. It's led by Maria Machado, the Nobel Prize recipient, Edmundo Gonzalez, who actually stood in for her and won the election. That the U.S. believes, and they weren't mentioned at all, nor was democracy. So this is a sea change from where the U.S. has always not only stood in the world, but wanted to stand in the world. Sounds like now that there's some kind of division, of hemispheric division between the United States and other countries that we used to call our adversaries.
So this action today, is this about the Western Hemisphere and more to do with Venezuela, or is this more to do with Russia?
Unclear, but of course, this vessel was going to Venezuela. The U.S., according to multiple reports that came out this morning, has told Venezuela that if they want to receive or sell any of their oil, and they are an almost 100% oil economy minus illicit drugs, that they will have to eject China, Russia, Iran from their country and do business exclusively with the United States, and apparently give us millions and millions of barrels of oil, which seems to be extortion almost. The first two, like, you could potentially argue that that is a legitimate foreign policy means, trying to exclude your adversaries from a country, but then to demand oil that is actually the property of the Venezuelan people, right? Not the regime which is still in place in Venezuela. That seems like a sea shift, and it's not. And that would make this seizure more related to Venezuela than I think than related to Russia or Ukraine. If the U.S. really wanted to support Ukraine, we would impose secondary sanctions. There's a bill in the Senate that would do just that, that has overwhelming bipartisan support. And we would approve more advanced weapon systems for Ukraine to use without restrictions against Russia. That's not happening. And so I think this is likely more about Venezuela.
If it is likely more about Venezuela, this ship, I said it was kind of confusing, but I get into the details. This ship in sort of September came from Iran. The US tried to intercept it in Venezuela, so it never made it to port. As far as we know, supposedly it is empty and doesn't have any oil on it. I know obviously the US stopped it today and put their statement out saying that it was in violation of US sanctions. But if there is nothing on board it, why is it of such importance to the US, the British military, and also obviously the Russian military who tried to come in and intercept it today?
That's a really good question, Fergus, and I don't know the answer, but we might find out today. There might be something on this vessel. Maybe it's weapons that were, illegally being brought into Venezuela, air and missile defense, advanced. I don't know, but you're right. It seems to be that if it was just about the oil and it never came to port to get the oil, why the pursuit? Why the direct confrontation with Russia? Why would it be worth it? We might find out that it's more than just about the ship, or it might be that the new policy is we're going to seize all of these sanctioned ships wherever they are, so they can't be used. And then with the idea that they would essentially run out of the means to be able to deliver and retrieve oil, illicit oil, from the U.S. perspective around the world.
The Kremlin warned them not to do it beforehand. Obviously, I mentioned that the flag on the ship changed from Guyanese to Russian. Does that, in your mind, does that mean that this would classify as an act of war?
So that's also a good question, and it really does come down to the law of the sea, right? So is a country allowed to claim ownership of a ship that deliberately avoided association with that country mid sail? It seems like that's not the case. I'm not an expert, but I think that would be highly dubious to be able to say, well, it was this ship, now it's our ship, now we painted, we reached over the side and painted the flag, and that makes it ours. I don't think the U.S. looks at it that way. I would guess that the international law of the sea doesn't either. It has to be disclosed at the time that it sets sail, I think, to be lawfully attached to the country.
We had this conversation earlier in the office. I guess there's the distinction between what the international law says and then what the Kremlin might think.
That's right. I mean, the Kremlin decided to invade a neighboring peaceful country. So their view of the law is whatever they want the law to be, it seems like.
And we're really, at the time of recording, we're kind of yet to hear much of a readout from Moscow on this. But I mean, ultimately, like I said, and the Russians sent at least a submarine. There were some reports of other naval vessels, and they didn't make it in time. Is this a humiliation for Vladimir Putin?
Somewhat. I mean, they probably would have been better off not claiming it, right? Because they claimed it right before it was seized, and then it kind of puts them in a very difficult position. If they don't do anything other than harsh statements, which are not very useful and expected, then it really does make them look like a paper tiger. If they sent all these naval assets, they didn't get there in time, they claimed the ship, and the U.S. still seized it, especially if it turns out there's something illicit on it. We don't know that to be the case, but there's speculation. It really makes them look bad, and it gives them the ownership they didn't necessarily have attached to them until they claim the actual ship. So this could have been a terrible diplomatically tactful way to go about it. But Russia does that often, and then makes up their own narrative.
Mm. You said about diplomatically there. I've sort of settled down slightly, but I mean, I was following this all day, kind of watching the ship on a tracker. And I did sort of start to think that are we closer to kind of a global diplomatic incident than we have been for a while?
I think we are, and that is because Russia claimed the ship. Whether they lawfully claimed the ship or not, they did. And so it probably is owned by Russia, right? I mean, I think that's the one thing that everybody can probably agree on with Russia. So it really does come to, because they've made it open and they made it public, they'll likely have to do something in response. If they don't, then from the power standpoint, they've lost considerable power. So whether that would be direct military action, I don't think so. Whether they'll pull out of any discussions on the future of Ukraine, plausible. They're looking to do that anyway. They've never really gainfully been involved in any serious discussions on ceasefire in Ukraine. I think it was simply to delay the consequences for their participation at all. But they could do that. And they could also, there's other things that they could potentially do that they don't think would bring them into direct military conflict with the U.S. military, which obviously wouldn't be in their interest.
That's pretty much all we know on that at the moment, but we will keep everyone updated on Times Radio as the situation progresses. Now, originally we were going to talk about Greenland this morning, so we'll move on to that now if we've got a bit of time. We've spent the last sort of few days on the Trump report speculating on just how serious the president is about acquiring Greenland. Last night, the White House made it quite publicly clear that they are serious.
They did, and that's really shocked many. I mean, I think uh, not only in Congress, but across the nation of the United States, they would never want to view the United States as such a poor ally that they would actually threaten to use military force to seize territory that is not theirs, that's from an ally. I mean, it would be one thing, also bad, to seize territory anywhere from anyone that's not yours. But to do it against a NATO ally is just, to many on both sides of the aisle, unconscionable to even be considering it. I don't think it would happen. I don't think the acquisition, if you want to put it that way, or the annexation of Greenland will ever happen. It has to be approved by Denmark. It has to be approved by Greenland. It would have to be a treaty. It'd have to be negotiated. It would have to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and all of the expenses, which would be considerable, would have to be approved by the U.S. House of Representatives. I don't think there's support for any of that by any party in either of those bodies. And then, of course, if it's not done by the end of this term, I have never heard of another politician on either side of the aisle who's talked about buying Greenland. So this could be just for this term and then completely be awashed. I mean, literally, and I don't think there's any chance we'd use military force, but say we did and bypassed all the diplomatic efforts, I do believe the next president would essentially give it back to Denmark. And this would be a bizarre chapter in world history. I just don't think it's going that way. I'm not sure why we're even talking about it. I think it's becoming very difficult for the allies of this administration to even come up with a defense of this at all. Yes, it is strategically important. Everybody knows that. But if it was that strategically important, the United States wouldn't have pulled a vast majority of the forces that we had there during the Cold War. And Greenland has offered to allow them to come back. So if that was the case, why aren't we sending our forces? And the reason, Fergus, why it is so important is any kind of ICBM attack by Russia to the United States would essentially, most of it, go over Greenland. That's why we're there in the Cold War. And you want to be able to shoot what they call the apogee, which is like the top of the trajectory of the weapon coming our way, and it's right under Greenland. So if it was that big of a concern, we would have already sent our forces back because Greenland is like open door. Yes, so that's if that was the case, why aren't we there?
I might, yeah, I might be adding two and two together and getting five here as well. But if that is true, as you say, the national security concerns, could you not make the argument that any country, the UK, could also claim, okay, then we'll take Greenland for the same reason?
Of course, yes, absolutely. Or NATO in general. Like, why isn't it NATO? And it has been, and it is in NATO. So, like, I think it's very perplexing to our NATO allies who, even if Greenland, for whatever reason, decided that they didn't want the U.S. military to come there, that's their prerogative. But at least there could be an internal debate inside NATO of the importance, and maybe we can talk Greenland into it, etc., Denmark into it. But the idea that Denmark and Greenland are like, send your forces. Like, what are you waiting for? If it's that important, why aren't they here? And that's a legitimate question. So that makes it, to many, this isn't really about that. It's more about economic exploitation of the resources that are now more accessible in the Arctic because of basically the ice melting and the climate change that's going on there. But even that, according to public reporting and statements by officials in Denmark and Greenland, they're totally open for the United States industries to come and help and look for these new resources which are becoming available. So it's very unclear. There's not a restriction on us, although this rhetoric could make a restriction. I mean, if you were the prime minister of Greenland or the leadership in Denmark, how keen would you be to allow U.S. military forces in now that we've claimed that we want it, right? We could actually, by this rhetoric, which I don't think is going to go anywhere, actually be hurting the very reasons why we say we need it, which is we could send our military force, we could have U.S. Industry going there, but they might think twice about that now, based on our stated intention to annex the territory.
And someone we've spoken about over the last few days who seems to maybe privately be doing things slightly differently from what Donald Trump has publicly said is Marco Rubio. And there was a report that I think I saw you retweet and I read it as well overnight that supposedly he had said privately to lawmakers they were seriously considering buying it. I mean, is that just Rubio briefing or do you think that actually is serious?
Well, he's probably right. I mean, that the U.S. is, at least the White House, is considering buying it. Now, let's remember, I mean, Secretary Rubio has had a long history in the Senate, in the intelligence community, working with foreign policy. I have never heard anybody there talk about doing this. So the chances that he supports this, other than the fact that he's currently the Secretary of State, are very slim, right? I mean, you don't go from your whole career never talking about this as a necessity to going, the U.S. needs to buy Greenland right now. But he is ultimately the secretary for President Trump. So I expect him to figure out how this would be done. And I think he's trying to simmer the concerns in the Senate about the idea that we want to do this at all. but certainly use military force. If military force is actually on the table under the War Powers Act, the United States Senate could stop it. They don't have to wait 60 days under the act to then say no more. They can preemptively say the action that you're preparing to do is not supported by the Senate, and they can cut off all funding for doing it. So the idea that we'd use military force, against everything the U.S. has stood for its existence, is also very unlikely because the Senate is not going to support it, and they have the ability under that act to essentially stop it from happening in the first place.
Mick Mulroy, it's been another crazy day in an incredibly busy first week of 2026. But thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thanks, Fergus. Great being with you.